by the apologist Sidney Collett, who says, quote, "In cases where little ones were slain, the mercy of God is even more conspicuous. The strong probability," notice he says probability, "is that in many cases, these poor little children, having the blood of their wicked parents in their veins, would, had they been allowed to live, have developed their parents' sins, but their early death saved them from so dreadful a future," unquote. What balderdash! Could one devise more absurd arguments? To begin with, God is showing anything but mercy. Killing babies, infants, and little children hardly falls under the category of mercy. Secondly, you don't punish or execute somebody on an assumption, or what Collett refers to as a strong probability, that he or she may commit a crime. The fact is that the person's not committed a crime, and punishment cannot justifiably be dispensed until he or she has done so. That's nothing more than common sense. Otherwise, anyone could be imprisoned at any time on the assumption that he or she was going to engage in criminal activity at some time in the future. In fact, you could even execute people and say that you prevented crimes that they would have committed had they lived. Thirdly, what is this blood in the veins nonsense? Since when are people judged by the kinds of parents they have? That reminds me of an older relative I had who used to refer to people as coming from good stock. This is one of those concepts that belongs in the Museum of Antiquities. And fourthly, if reasoning of this kind were carried to its logical conclusion, we should kill all babies, not only to prevent any sins or crimes they may commit, but to prevent any possibility, even the possibility of them committing acts that would exclude them from heaven. They should be killed just to be on the safe side. After all, why allow them to jeopardize an eternity of bliss in heaven by having 70 or 80 years of earthly temptation and access to sin? Another problem with biblical justice and the God of the Bible is the latter's obvious inclination to allow suffering to reign supreme. Why God allows suffering and evil to even exist, much less dominate, is a question that has always bothered Christians and all other believers in a divine or supreme being. If God is as merciful, just, and kind as His followers would have us believe, then why doesn't He just destroy all sources of evil and suffering? One can't help but think of the question posed to Robinson Crusoe by his native friend Friday on that tropical island during one of their religious indoctrination sessions. Friday said, "Why he not kill devil?" Good question. Certainly he has the power. The apologist Frank Colquhoun indirectly addresses this issue when he is asked on page 93 of his work entitled Hard Questions. He's asked, why does God allow the innocent to suffer? He says in response, quote, "In honesty, we must recognize this problem and admit the great burden of undeserved suffering that is passed upon people due to malnutrition, poverty, disasters, and disease. Nothing is gained by trying to belittle this paradox." Of course, that being the paradox that God, who is loving and good, has placed man in a world where the innocent often suffer. He continues, "It is beyond our finite minds to understand why God permits," and he says permits, tragic suffering which appears to have no possible beneficial result, unquote. Quoquahan conveniently fails to mention that according to the Bible, God does not just allow suffering and injustice, He's a primary contributor. It's always interesting to note that nearly every time biblicist are faced with a dilemma of this nature, they avoid the inevitable conclusion that God is something less than they would wish and retire to the more comfortable, although far less honest, suggestion that the answer is beyond man's limited intelligence and will be provided in the great beyond. It's another one of those mysteries placed at strategic points in Christian mythology. Let's face facts. Their effort to escape the unavoidable, the conclusion that can't be escaped, is a blatant cop-out. That completes our listing of biblical injustices for today. In our next program, we'll continue to examine major iniquities associated with biblical teachings. We'd like to conclude by reading a couple of letters we received several years ago. The first came from St. Louis, Missouri, and the writer says, quote, "Dear Dennis, how do you respond to someone who draws a circle, a large circle, and then tells you that all of the knowledge of the universe is represented inside that circle? In other words, inside the circle is all knowledge.